No, I think that's right. I think we over-focus, in a sense, on the financial system itself. What were the details of too big to fail banks or undercapitalized banks or shadow banking activity, which led to, or indeed, bad behavior of individual bankers, which led to the crisis itself. And it's important, that we do focus on that, and we say, have we re-regulated to make sure that the likelihood of a crisis of that sort is reduced? I actually think it is. I think the financial system itself is much safer than it was 10 years ago. But what that financial system did was to create a hell of a lot of debt, huge amounts of debt, but not just in the 5 years before 2008, in the 50 years. Private debt as a percent of GDP in all the advanced economies together went from 50% of GDP in 1950 to 170% by 2007. And my worry is that although we have made the financial system itself safer, actually the total amount of debt in the global economy, debt owned by governments or by the private sector, is now actually higher as a percentage of global GDP than others, because all we've really done since 2008 is shift the debt around. In the developed economies, we've managed to delever a little bit in the private sectors, but with a big increase in public debt. We've had a slowdown of the growth of debt in the developed economies, but a huge explosion of debt in China. And so you end up with a global economy where we sort of need very low interest rates to make this huge debt pile sustainable. But those very low interest rates are an open invitation for people to do some very risky, high leverage things. And that is, to me, the unresolved problem. So do I sit here worrying that we will suddenly this autumn get a repeat of a Lehman's type event where a major over-leveraged broker-dealer goes bankrupt and then we're worried about all the other banks going bankrupt? Well, I hope I'm not being too optimistic. I simply don't think that's going to occur. But am I worried that sometime in the next 2 years, a set of stresses in the global economy which have to do with the way that we use debt to drive growth will produce a slowdown, and a slowdown in which we'll then be scratching our heads and saying, hang on, what do we do now? Because our interest rates are already very low, so we can't reduce them further. Our fiscal deficit's already high, so we can't increase that. That's what worries me, rather than the detailed guts of the financial system.
The other side
itself.
of the coin is that the US economy is growing pretty well. The numbers are great. Best confidence figures this century. Best non-manufacturing for 14 years. 4.2% GDP. Great unemployment figures in the last 48 hours as well. And yet the EM stresses on the back of minuscule rises in US rates are already becoming apparent.
Well, 2 points to that. I mean, the US economy is booming because it has just received a massive fiscal stimulus. So the fiscal debts of the US government, the deficit, had been brought down from about 10% in 2009. It was getting down to about 3% by 2016. With, of course, the Republican Party saying these deficits are far, far too big, and only some irresponsible Democrats like Larry Summers saying we need a higher deficit to get the economy going. Trump has unleashed a massive increase in the US fiscal deficit. It's going from 3%, it'll be up at 5%, it'll be up at 6%. This is a large deficit when an economy was already growing. Now, everything we know about economics says if you put in a huge stimulus to an economy that is already growing, you'll make it grow faster. But out there, you'll probably create inflation, and you'll create increases in interest rates, which will slow it down. So, as Marty Feldstein said here yesterday, the US economy is growing very, very strongly, but it is fragile because it is based on a really huge fiscal stimulus. Now, simultaneously, we are seeing the emergence of a problem which is really a chronicle of a crisis foretold. For the last 3 or 4 years, anybody who knows what's going on in the global economy, asked where the next debt crisis is going to come from, has been saying it's going to come from dollar-denominated debt issued by corporates or quasi-statal institutions in emerging markets, where those guys have been issuing debt, dollar debt, because it's been a very low interest. But when US interest rates go up, and when the dollar goes up because US interest rates are going to go up, that debt is going to look very expensive. And that is what's happening in Turkey. That's what's happening to a degree in Argentina. Could be worries about Indonesia as well. That emerging market dollar-denominated debt problem, it's, every now and then there are just things which we've talked about for years, completely foreseeable, and now we're facing it.
So if I have to say, the next great financial crisis, if there is going to be another one, is not going to be a clone of the last one. We've already discussed that. Is it going to be something you just discussed, or is it going to come from somewhere else? Is it going to come from trade? Is it going to come from geopolitics?
What to me, where do I think the next slowdown in the global economy has come from? I think it could come from...
Slowdown's good, Adair.
Oh, yeah, well, you need a slowdown, but the issue is how do we get a slowdown in a controllable way? So I think it could come in two ways. The global economy has got going again over the last 4 years because of two very big fiscal stimulus, one from the US and the other from China. China over the last 2 years has taken its fiscal deficit from 1% to 4% of GDP because it's been trying to slow down the bank debt boom, but it's been offsetting it with a fiscal growth. So what could happen over the next 2 years is, first of all, the sheer scale of the Trumpian expansion in the US could lead to inflationary pressures, which produces a faster increase in US interest rates than we anticipate. And that may then produce quite a sudden slowdown in the US economy. Marty was saying yesterday, about 2020. Simultaneously, the Chinese want to rebalance their economy. They want it to be less based on investment and construction. It's running at 6.5%. They can afford to slow it down to 5% to make it more balanced. They may want to do that. But when that slows down to 5%, that slows the global economy down. Those two things together could produce a big slowdown in the global economy in 2020, then a slowdown in the European economy. And where do I think the trouble will then arise? Well, maybe right here. Italian government debt is only sustainable if the Italian economy keeps going. You just need a small recession across the European Union, perhaps driven by those two big factors that I've talked about, and we could be back to talking about what are you going to do about Italian debt. So if you ask me the specific debt issues that I'm most worried about, there are some issues of consumer debt. I mean, there are some very specific things. US student debt is getting very big, and that's going to hit the consumption of young US consumers. They've just piled up so much debt. But the really big ones are probably the emerging market corporate debt and, I think, Italian sovereign debt. That one worries me.
Hey everybody, it's Hadley Gamble from our new CNBC Middle East Bureau in Abu Dhabi. Thanks for stopping by. Now to watch more, you can try one of the videos that just popped up on your screen. And don't forget to subscribe.